welcome to the Dole Institute. My name is Kenna McNally, and I am a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement in the Institute, including volunteering at programs and networking with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu or speaking with a student worker after the program. A video of today's program will be available on our YouTube channel soon. You can also access videos of past programs by visiting our YouTube channel at any time. A loop hearing system is available if you have a T-coil hearing aid. We also have a limited number of listening devices. If you have questions about the loop system, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members. After the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker will bring a microphone to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. If you are a part of our virtual audience, you may submit your questions at dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to turn off your cell phones. Now, please join me in welcoming Director of the Dole Institute, Audrey Coleman.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Kenna. That was a great job you did on the introduction. Well done. Good evening, everyone. I'll welcome you again to the Dole Institute of Politics, and this is especially exciting to reconvene for the third session of our presidential lecture series as we embark on Women's History Month. So what a nice chance to get together. And fortunately, we missed the coinciding with the KU basketball game, which is always a win. So glad to see you all here. Tonight's program, led by Dr. Diana Carlin, is First Ladies, Women's Rights, and Suffrage, and is presented in partnership with the First Ladies Association for Research and Education, as well as KU's History and American Studies programs. And there will be a book sale and signing following the program in the Darby Gallery up at the front of the building. I want to be sure and invite you back to join us on Thursday, March 23rd for the fourth and final installment of our presidential lecture series. The program will feature First Ladies, the ERA, and beyond, and our guests will be Flair President and First Ladies scholar Myra Gutin, and curator, author, and consultant to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library, Bob Bostock. So we'll want to see you back here in a few weeks after you have a wonderful spring break vacation next week. This evening's program will be moderated by Dr. Diana Carlin, and I'll now turn the floor over to her so she can introduce our esteemed guests this evening. Thanks again for being with us.
Thank you, Audrey. And thank you all for being here. We were a little nervous given the basketball game, but it ended early enough, and the weather, and it's great to see such a wonderful turnout for our third program. How many of you were here for the second? Did any of you hear Rebecca Roberts on NPR yesterday? Yes. Okay, if you didn't, go on NPR. Rebecca was interviewed by Steve Inskeep because her book came out 2 days ago. And so a lot of what you heard, some of that's on there, but we got much more detail than Steve Inskeep was able to do. But it was kind of fun to kind of follow up on our last program. So as Audrey said, this is also Women's History Month. So when we were planning this, we decided that the focus of the two presidential lecture series in March would be on women's history as it relates to First Ladies. So what we're going to be doing tonight is starting at the very beginning with Martha and Dolly and Abigail, and moving up to Lady Bird Johnson. And then the last program will go from Lady Bird on. So we want to also put this in perspective. I think one of the important things we've tried to pull through in the last two programs was that so much of what these women were able to or not able to do was dependent on what was going on culturally, historically, their own relationship with their husband, what issues their husbands were dealing with, and that historical context was really important. And one of the things that happened after the Revolutionary War to kind of set the context for these first few women was something that we call the development of what we now term Republican, small r, motherhood or wifehood. And before the Revolutionary War, men and women's roles often overlapped, and there wasn't this real clear division. But after the Revolutionary War, they expected women to sort of step back, and that their role was to make their children good citizens. So look after the education, tend to the home, support their husbands, but make sure that this civic pride in the country was there, and that they were good wives and mothers. And so that had some impact on what they were and weren't able to do. And over the years then, a lot of the political issues kind of intervened with their ability to talk about something or support openly suffrage. So kind of with that as a perspective, I'm going to start with directing a question to Nancy. Let me give you a couple comments about the two of them. Nancy, you all can read these, but Nancy spent, 30 years with the National Archives, and she began her career after finishing college at the University of Texas at the Johnson Library and worked very closely with Mrs. Johnson. In fact, Nancy was an honorary pallbearer at her funeral. She's worked with 8 first ladies over all those administrations. So someone who has seen first ladies since, Lady Bird up close, personal, and handled their papers. And so Nancy definitely is an expert. Next to Nancy, who will get the next question after Nancy gets started, is my good friend, Stacy Cordery from Iowa State University, professor of history. She's written on several first ladies and is in the middle of a really interesting book on, it's Rubenstein, right? No. Arden.
Elizabeth Arden.
Elizabeth Arden. I saw War Paint, and so the Broadway play, so apologize about that.
No worries.
But really is an expert on the Gilded Age, and I think you just became the president of the Gilded Age Society, is that right?
Vice President and President-elect of
Very
the
good.
Society for Historians of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era.
Yeah.
Very long name.
So Stacy's going to concentrate on the women of that era. So let me start with Nancy. And the first 3 women really helped define the role. And can you tell us a little bit about their attitudes about women, women's rights, and what restrictions they might have had as they were starting this role?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the Dole Institute for having us and sponsoring what I think is a very important group of lectures on First Ladies. The first 3 First Ladies, Martha, Abigail, and Dolly, were extraordinary women, and the nation was very lucky to have them as we were to have their husbands. I think in looking at their attitudes toward women, you need to remember that these 3 women are seeing a nation set up which had founding documents based on equality and democracy, except they weren't being included in those concepts. And so there was a little disconnect there. Martha believed in women maintaining their independence. She was from a very elite Virginia family, and she married George when she was widowed from an extremely wealthy man, and she brought George quite a bit of money. And she had her own plantation and additionally ran Mount Vernon. And she, since George traveled so much, ran it very competently, at times in business deals having to call in a man to actually effect the business deal. But she was quite competent. She believed in education for women and had her granddaughter and grandson both made arrangements for them both to receive education. And she made this great statement to her niece, which I think shows quite a bit about Martha. I wish you to be as independent as your circumstances will admit. A dependence is, I think, a ratchet thing. Now, a ratchet state, I say ratchet because Martha was a terrible speller, and of course she means wretched, but I thought it was funny to say it the way Martha said it. Martha didn't have as much education as Abigail. So Martha created a beginning of the role for a first lady, Abigail was a strong manager and businesswoman and ran John's, their farm, and sold fabric. And she is very well known. And I think she's our earliest woman First Lady revolutionary. Well known for her lobbying of John to include women's rights in the rights of the new nation. What most people don't realize is at this time, coverture, C-O-V-E-R-T-U-R-E, was the rule, and that was from the British law system. And that meant when you were born or when you were married, as a woman, you had no rights. All your rights passed to your husband. So you basically didn't exist except as one entity. And Abigail very much wanted John to change the British law system for the new nation. And so she wrote her famous letter in 1776, and I'm going to read a little bit more of what she wrote so that you can get it in more context. In the new code of laws, I desire that you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. In particular attention is not paid to the ladies. We are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by laws in which we have no voice or representation. So I think we can safely say she's the first revolutionary for women's rights. John somewhat responded to that. They were a very close couple, but he sort of was dismissive of that letter. It bothered him, but not enough to do anything about it in the documents he was writing. Abigail definitely advocated for more rights, education. She believed education was so important for women and equality for women. And then you have Dolly from a very different background. And Dolly, with her social entertaining and her genius at bringing foes of her husband together and being so gracious and kind and mixing with them, she created really the idea of bipartisanship in entertainment, elevated the social functions, and became an extremely popular First Lady, not only to government people, but outside to the public. And in doing that, I feel that Dolly really elevated the role of women in terms of being more public and in terms of what they could do. So that's sort of what I think of. I probably left out things because these women are so important, but I try and hit the main points.
Very good. Thank you, Nancy. Stacy, after those first three, who are some of the notable women who either advanced women's rights or maybe didn't get quite as far as we would have liked?
Well, I have been given the task, really, of covering the 19th century First Ladies, and I feel a little cheated because even though there's a lot of them, there's not a lot of them who I think we could say really promoted women's rights. So in an effort to try to put this in context and start with the big picture, I thought I would summarize for you 3 points that a colleague of ours, Betty Boyd Caroli, made in her groundbreaking book in 1987, where she said, Dr. Caroli said, 1829 to around 1869, there were a whole series of First Ladies who said that they were invalids, and as a result of their invalidism, their poor health, they couldn't conduct themselves as First Ladies in a public way. And so Betty Caroli said, why was this? And when she looked into it, she found 3 possible reasons why so many First Ladies essentially opted out of this, of this position. One was, she said, going back to, in part, what Diana said, as the 19th 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 women began to lose that, the day-to-day side-by-side work with men. And so we began to get what is often called a women's sphere, and women were not welcome any longer in the public sphere, the amoral or perhaps immoral world of capitalism. And yet these were women who were married to intelligent, politically involved men and who had spent most of their lives helping him climb the political ladder. And now that society said, you shouldn't do that anymore, at least not in public, some of these women crossed their arms and said, well, fine. And they, in a sort of way, took their toys and went home and thought, if my life has become so circumscribed that I can't participate in a way I had before, I'm not going to participate, and I will stay in my study where I can control things, and I will have a lively intellectual life of my own. Another reason is that by this time, the Washington cave dwellers, as they were known, these are the women and men in Washington, D.C., who were not connected to elected politicians. So they stayed while every 4 or 8 years the parade changed. The cave dwellers made their own rules for society. They set up an etiquette system. They had very high standards for social entertaining, which was really politicking, and quite often the cave dwellers could look down their noses a bit at these first ladies who they considered, in some cases, country bumpkins coming in from the West, like Ohio. And the third thing that Betty Crowley found is that over these early years, age was no longer venerated in America, that we had embraced our youth as a country, and we'd said, right, we've thrown off the yoke of old Europe, and so we are now going to emphasize how wonderful it is to be a young country and dynamic and so forth. And so there was a change that was reflected in clothing. So clothing styles no longer looked all that great on matronly middle-aged women, and there was not the respect paid to older women. And so most of these women in the first ladies in this era who were middle-aged said, I'm going to hand this public position, this public entertaining, over to my young, beautiful niece or my young, beautiful daughter and let them do it. So who were these people? Let's see. There was Eliza Monroe, Louisa Catherine Adams, Anna Harrison claimed invalidism, so did Letitia Tyler, Margaret Taylor, Abigail Fillmore, Jane Pierce, Eliza Johnson. All claimed invalidism. We don't see much from Julia Tyler because she was quite young and was only in office for a very short amount of time. And then, of course, you'll notice if you were paying attention to earlier iterations of this series, one big person who does not fit Dr. Crowley's mold is Sarah Polk. Sarah Polk, very close to her husband, very much a partner in things, but she was not interested in what was happening in New York at Seneca Falls. She was First Lady when the Seneca Falls First Women's Rights Conference happened. And one reason is because Sarah Polk came from a Southern family that enslaved people. And any time the topic of reform came up, whether it was women's reform or some other kind of reform, the proximate reform was slavery. And so Sarah Polk was not interested in talking about abolition. And then, of course, as Nancy reminds me, the other big person who doesn't fit this is Mary Todd Lincoln.
Mary Todd Lincoln is sort of the exception to the rule, because she comes in and she certainly does meet Stacy's concept of the Washington cave dwellers, and they're not taking well to someone who came in from Kentucky. And Mary Lincoln is very aware of this. And instead of standing back or being shy, Mary Lincoln had always been very much a part of Lincoln's political career. She comes in strong and hard. She didn't take that great advice we've all been given, I'm sure, that maybe when you get a new job, you wait a year, you learn what's going on, and then you make your move. You know, that's really great advice. And I think she could have benefited from it, and she came on. The other thing I remembered when Diana and Stacy were talking is, as this evolves, the press at the time gets very, very critical. Okay, so Mary Lincoln wears a low-cut dress, and I really don't even feel comfortable saying what the press said about her in that dress. It was so disgusting. They get very critical of the appearance in a way that wasn't quite the way it was with Dolly and Abigail and Martha. And Mary Lincoln sort of did everything wrong. You know, in terms of, I'm not saying everything Mary Lincoln ever did was wrong, because she supported emancipation, she stood by her husband, she supported abolition, but I am saying that she didn't help herself at all, because she tried to be so out front and did not retreat.
It was the optics. Right, Julia Grant entertained the same way that Mary Todd Lincoln did. 29-course meals Julia Grant had, except that there was no war.
Yeah.
So you know, the balls, the expensive clothing, the expensive wallpaper, that was Mary Todd Lincoln not quite reading the room, reading the nation, I might say.
Yeah. So after the Civil War then, well, let's talk about Julia for a minute. She had a friendship with someone important. Who was that?
Julia Grant.
Julia Grant,
Julia Grant is not actually on record saying that she is pro-suffrage, but Susan B. Anthony wrote a letter to a friend in 1870 saying, Julia Grant favors suffrage. And then, interestingly, in 1872, Susan B. Anthony illegally voted for her husband, not Anthony's husband, voted for Grant. And of course found herself tossed in jail for that, earning the lifelong loyalty of Ulysses and Julia Grant. But Grant would soon die. By 1896 or so, Julia Grant will be on record as pro-suffrage, but it'll just take her a little bit longer.
Yeah. So it was interesting. There were several first ladies who had some connection with Susan B. Anthony. But you're a Gilded Age scholar, Stacy, so what can you tell us about the women of the Gilded Age?
I think it's interesting if we pause for a moment, if I might, and remind us why some women, leaving aside the men for a minute, why some women might be so opposed to suffrage. Because there's a goodly number of women, first ladies, certainly, who were opposed to suffrage. If this were my classroom, I would now say, any ideas, anyone? So I'm sure you probably all know that the biggest reason to be opposed to suffrage, opposed to women having the vote, is that it was against God's plan. It was not the way it was supposed to be, that it would potentially unsex women and it might unsex men, because that's not the way God wanted it. People said that women did not want the vote, so there was no point in fighting for suffrage because women didn't want it. Some people said women, if you give them the vote, they will be too busy to vote. They've got the home to take care of and everything else, so it doesn't matter. Many people said women weren't smart enough to vote, that God had given them a uterus and not a brain for a reason. Some people said women weren't educated enough. They simply didn't know enough because women were not certainly going to school at equal percentages of men at the time. Some other people said there's no point in giving women the vote because if you give women the vote, all they will do is vote as their husbands do, and that will simply double the vote, so what's the point? And then going back to the idea of that separate spheres, women should not be given the vote because that would move them into that potentially corrupt world of politics, into that public role that women should not hold. So there are many reasons why women didn't support suffrage, and many reasons why some first ladies didn't support suffrage, but it's worth remembering too that suffrage was a radical idea. In 1848, when those women and those fewer men at Seneca Falls decided to sign on to that, it was shocking. And so women and men who supported women's suffrage were thought of as like just beyond the pale and a little hard to understand for many, many years until we got right upon it. So that and the combination of it being thought of as unfeminine was enough to take a lot of people out. Okay.
So there were some women, though, who really did advance women's rights, some of the first ladies from that era.
Yeah, Frances Cleveland, sort of to go in order, even though she was young, did not. Frankie Cleveland thought that women's suffrage would unsex a woman, and she was so anti-suffrage that she eventually would join the New York State Anti-Suffrage Association. Caroline Harrison, remember there was the Democrat Cleveland and then Harrison and then Cleveland again. So Caroline Harrison was the one in the middle. She was actually a founder of the Daughters of the American Revolution, which when it was first begun, was actually fairly pro-women's rights. Caroline Harrison may have given the first public speech as a First Lady, and in that speech, which was to the DAR, she lauded the founding mothers and said the early republic, the nation never would have been launched had it not been for the work of the first ladies and the other women of the era. In 1890, Caroline Harrison, while First Lady, said that she would raise money for Johns Hopkins Medical School if they would allow women to come in as students, which they did 3 years later. And she was also the one lobbying her husband to put the first female stenographer on the president's staff. So Caroline Harrison did that. Ida McKinley, you don't think of Ida McKinley. I think really no one thinks about Ida McKinley. Poor Mrs. McKinley. She was truly an invalid, and so that was partly why. But Ida McKinley, I was amazed to learn, there was a big suffrage convention in Washington, D.C. in 1896, and Ida McKinley said she would not meet with the anti-suffrage contingent that came to meet with her husband. But later in the day, she did meet with Susan B. Anthony, and she said to Susan B. Anthony, I am in favor of women's suffrage and women's rights, and I want you to convey that message to the women at the conference tonight.
And
So-
as did her husband. I mean, McKinley
Yes.
came out for suffrage.
He did, yeah. So I think some of the influence, some women are influenced by family members to support or not support suffrage. Then there was Edith Roosevelt, who had another reason for not supporting suffrage. Most of the Roosevelt women did not support suffrage because they belonged to an extraordinarily wealthy class of people in America, and many very wealthy women, but not all. Many wealthy women believed, as one of them put it, that she had more power around her dining room table because of her status and her wealth. She could summon people around her. She had more power around her dining room table than she ever had with one vote. So Edith Roosevelt would come around, of course. Theodore Roosevelt will launch a third-party movement in 1912, and by that time she will be on board with the vote. Helen Taft, who followed Mrs. Roosevelt, said she was a qualified suffragist. She said the vote should only go to women who could prove that they knew what all the issues were about. And to her credit, she also said that should be true of men as well.
Sounds like something we should consider again.
Indeed. So Helen Taft is not actually on record as saying that she's in favor of women's rights until a year and a half after her mother was publicly quoted in the New York Times as having been a suffragist. So maybe an influence from her mom. Then we're at Edith Wilson. I'm leaving aside Ellen Wilson, Woodrow Wilson's first wife. And Edith Wilson apparently, Edith Wilson, very different career path, if you will, to get to First Lady. She had a long life on her own and married a sitting president, must have been an odd thing to do. And she was pretty much in favor of women's rights until she got to the White House. And then, while she was First Lady, and highly protective of her husband, and I must remind us that she was newlywed. So as we used to say in Texas, she was still stupid in love with Wilson. And she really had a problem with the suffragists who were chaining themselves to the fence out there and were holding the placards that were criticizing the president. And it really turned her personally away from suffrage. So her husband, Woodrow Wilson, will come to suffrage in 1918 before she will return to it again. And then, of course, she'll get there and she'll vote like all the first ladies who had once 1920 comes along.
Some of these women, like Lucy Hayes, was the first to have a college degree. She kept quiet about it. Like you said, some of them opposed it. But there were political issues that their husbands had to deal with that got mixed in with suffrage. And I think that's one of the important things is that women's rights actually grew out of the abolition movement, which goes back to the Sarah Polk point that being a Southerner, she was not about ready to start connecting herself with these radical Northern women, because most of those women were Northern and many of them Quakers, and they were abolitionists. And so she stayed away, as did some of those other Southern First Ladies. But as we got into the Gilded Age and then a little later, what were the issues that their husbands were dealing with that they needed to not connect themselves directly with suffrage and women's rights, to not put their husband in a difficult position? Nancy, I know you've got a couple ideas on that.
What were the issues
Mm-hmm.
that their husbands were dealing with so that they did not
Right,
want to
right,
connect themselves
right.
with? Well, I think a lot of it goes back to what you're saying, that the women's movement was very aggressive. And the husbands are dealing with all of these very difficult issues, and they're also looking at their election, re-election, and they don't want to alienate on an issue that, I hate to say it, most of them did not feel was a key issue that they wanted to lose votes on.
Yeah.
You know, there's a real interesting saying, and I'll bring it in here because we're talking about a mixed bag here, and I just heard it at a speech the other night, that history isn't a sunny side egg up, it's scrambled. And so in this case, you know, there's the good with the bad. There's some good steps forward and bad. And I don't think you can lessen the role personality plays. These women, as Stacy and Diana have said, many of them came from very powerful families, very wealthy. And a lot of times it's how you approach people and how you approach an issue. And sometimes when people are really centered on one issue, they hurt themselves in their approach. But I don't know if that really answers your question.
Well, I mentioned Lucy Hayes. She had a nickname, Lemonade Lucy. That was because she would not serve alcohol at the White House. She was a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So how did Prohibition and also the labor union movement, especially conditions for women, how did that play into this whole notion of women's suffrage, women's rights, and their husbands' political positions?
Well, the labor union movement was very associated with the suffrage movement. And so if the president was not supportive of that, he and his wife, and we need to get into the relationships here, that the women, the wives, the first ladies would need to be empowered by their husbands to have an independent opinion and speak that independent opinion.
Prohibition was problematic because men like to drink, and the fear was that if you gave women the vote, women would somehow put a stop to that. So,
And guess what?
as it turns out. So that anytime a woman might get the vote, particularly if men had, okay, so to say that women were supposed to be pious, pure, domestic, and submissive to any historian is a sort of a very, it's an old sort of shorthand way that we can teach the role society gave to women in the mid to late 19th century. So for a woman to break out of that, one way she did it, and this is part of the way that Carrie Chapman Catt managed to help get the vote for women, was to say, fine, you want us to stay home, to be pious, okay, pure, domestic, submissive. That domestic part means we're here, we pick up your socks, we make your food, we take care of the children, and so forth. But now, as Kat said, you know, by the time you reach 1900 or so, you men, you've made a hash of the city. The Gilded Age, industrialization, immigration, urbanization, it brought a slew of ills, right? Unregulated corporate growth, environmental destruction, all sorts of problems. Immigrants in dire straits. Nobody had even devoted time to the plight of black Americans since, you know, the 1870s. So all these problems. Kat and other women embraced a concept they called municipal housekeeping, which was essentially saying, you told us we're good at cleaning up the house, give us the vote and we'll clean up the city. So that's great, unless your sense of cleaning up the city also involves, now you're going to tell me not to drink. So a first lady had to play in tandem with her husband's program, or with the party's ideas about what he could successfully pass. It's really important.
The last session, we talked about Florence Harding and what a powerful first lady she was. She and Grace Coolidge in 1920 were able to vote for their husbands for president and vice president. And unfortunately, because Harding, died relatively early in his career, Florence didn't get a chance to influence as much, but she was definitely a suffragist. Grace Coolidge was a woman who'd had a career. She taught at a school for the deaf. She was, once again, very well educated. Why did Grace kind of lag behind once she'd cast a vote and not do any more for women's rights? Do you have any opinions on that?
Well, she had a husband who didn't empower her.
She said.
He wanted her, he was okay with buying beautiful dresses for her and having her look like a fashion plate, but he didn't even want, like, she went out riding, and he didn't even like her showing that she could be a sportswoman. That was how controlling the situation was.
Yeah. Which is, I think, a really important point, that there's only so much they could do if the husbands weren't willing to let them do it. So let's talk now about Lou Henry Hoover. You're an Iowan, or at least living in Iowa. Did Lou begin to change some of this?
Lou Henry Hoover was born in Waterloo, Iowa, and spent the first little bit of time there, then moved to California and west. Lou Henry Hoover is often looked at as a kind of a precursor to Eleanor Roosevelt. In many ways, I think she was that. They were only born a decade apart. Lou Henry Hoover was older than Eleanor Roosevelt. But, Lou Hoover had a cluster of causes that she pursued as First Lady, including things to make life better for women and children. Those are two of her causes. She had a massive network that could have matched, I think, Eleanor Roosevelt's, if you put them head to head. She had, starting back in 1898, Lou Hoover had worked with the Red Cross in the Spanish-American War. And she was involved in a large number of organizations, women's organizations, including the League of Women Voters and the General Federation of Women's Clubs, and a Women's Amateur Athletic Association, and the Girl Scouts of the USA. And in every single one of these organizations and more, Lou Hoover took a leadership role. Extremely organized woman, very, very much a problem solver, just one of those sort of natural leaders to whom people looked up. As First Lady, Lou Hoover made herself available to the press. She had ongoing, I wouldn't say press conferences like Eleanor Roosevelt's, but she certainly was very aware of the press and made them a part of what she did as First Lady. She didn't just invite them to the White House like Florence Harding did before events to say, here's what I'm doing, please, feel free to write about it. She actually invited journalists to events and they came as guests. So an understanding of the role of the press is important. Lou Hoover gave national radio broadcasts, a whole handful of them, and she gave national radio broadcasts as First Lady on behalf of some of her causes. So that preceded Eleanor Roosevelt's work. Before Eleanor Roosevelt, Lou Hoover, with her husband, established what was called Camp Rapidan in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And they used it as a kind of a Camp David, inviting all sorts of people there, but also using it as a kind of a hideaway for themselves at times. And so Lou Hoover brought the Girl Scouts there, and she brought League of Women Voters folks. She had all sorts of people there, and it became apparent to them the dire poverty in the area. And so in a kind of a precursor to Arthurdale, what Lou and Herbert Hoover did was to create what was called the President's Mountain School, which was a school to teach children, but also ultimately adults. And they built the school, they funded it, they maintained it, they got books for it. They were deeply involved in this school. And another example of Lou Hoover wanting to make sure that particularly the girls at the school were educated and had a path up and out of poverty. One of her biggest causes was the Girl Scouts. I could spend the next 10 hours telling you about all the things Lou Hoover did with the Girl Scouts. Probably you wouldn't stay around for that, but well, she first got involved with the Girl Scouts in 1917, and then she became a president of Girl Scouts in 1922, so she was a national leader of Girl Scouts. She worked with Girl Scouts all throughout. One big difference between all these things that Eleanor Roosevelt did as First Lady, and about Nancy, we'll speak to this in a minute, and Lou Hoover, is the fact that, of course, Lou Hoover was a Republican, and Eleanor Roosevelt was a Democrat. And so one of the things that plays a role in whether a First Lady will support women's suffrage or women's rights is the party, her party, or her husband, their party. And volunteerism was the program that Herbert Hoover utilized to try to fight the Great Depression. So I'm not a Hoover apologist, but the Hoovers couldn't know how bad this depression was going to be or how long it was going to go on. But volunteerism was, let's have the community members support other community members. If you have a lot, give some of whatever you have to make things better, rather than use the power of the federal government. So Camp Rapidan was that. The Girl Scouts, that's exactly what the Girl Scouts did. She mobilized the Girl Scouts to go out in their communities and pitch in wherever they could. She tapped into the women of the General Federation of Women's Clubs all across the nation. As letters came into her as First Lady more and more, all these appeals from women, they were mostly from women, she would send them off to this vast women's network she had among the League of Women Voters or other groups and try to help them that way. She always kept herself hidden. Lou Hoover was not the sort to go around the country the way Eleanor Roosevelt will go. But she will set the stage and do many of the things that I think we credit Eleanor Roosevelt for. But the Hoover's presidency is so overshadowed by the Great Depression and by the Hoover's inability to cure it, essentially, that I think we don't pay as much attention to Lou Hoover as I think we should, and that could be because I live in Iowa.
Well, I live in Kansas, and I don't think she's gotten her due either, but we'll turn to a woman who has gotten her due.
Yes.
When Richard Norton Smith has been here, he's often referred to the ranking of presidents, and he's kind of gone through that, if some of you have been to that program. There have been several polls that have also ranked first ladies. And consistently on the 5 polls that have happened, and it's mainly of historians and people like us who they asked to do that, Eleanor Roosevelt has been #1 on all of them. And some of it has to do with what she did in terms of not only moving the role of First Lady forward, but also women. So Nancy, you've written a lot about Eleanor lately, so what can you tell us about her?
Well, I mean, Eleanor Roosevelt, we could be here for a long time.
Absolutely.
It's just an amazing woman, as a woman, promoting women and doing things for women, and in just every way. But it's very interesting. Eleanor Roosevelt, and she writes a lot, and she wrote so many autobiographies, and she says that the first time she really thought about suffrage, because it goes back to Casey's point about she was from a very elite family and had a lot of power, was in 1911 when FDR, as a state assemblyman in New York, came out to vote for the right for women. And Eleanor thinks about it, and she makes the aside, well, since Franklin was for it, I guess I should be. So that's sort of the beginning. When Franklin was in New York, and essentially at this stage, their marriage was more of a political partnership, she was freed, and she got very active in the League of Women Voters, the women's division of the DNC, was supporter of women's trade union, and all of these supported a stronger role for women, stronger rights for women, stronger jobs for women. But it's very interesting. It's the scramble of history. While Eleanor supported women's rights and worked mightily for legislation to improve those rights, she was hesitant, as was a group of her supporters, about endorsing the Equal Rights Amendment. She felt, as did other of her friends, that it might take rights away from women the way the amendment was worded.
Yeah, Nancy,
And-
let me interject something just for clarity, because we're going to be talking about this, the 1976 version. But Alice
this-
Paul,
Yes.
who was one of the leaders, along with Carrie Chapman Catt, who got the 19th Amendment through, actually wrote the Equal Rights Amendment.
Amendment.
And this is the time period you're talking about, the
Yes.
Alice Paul Amendment.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And so she was sort of lukewarm on that. When she became First Lady, she had heard from Lorena Hickok, a friend of hers who was a very prominent journalist, that the women journalists in Washington were basically starving because they couldn't cover powerful people. So what does Eleanor do 3 days after she's First Lady and has complained that she thinks her life being valuable is over? She holds her first press conference and only allows women. And so she essentially endorsed the women journalists and fed them, given how long FDR was president, for years. And she definitely used those women press conferences for policy. I mean, she talked to Harry Hopkins a little bit, and the idea was they were going to talk about home things, and she wasn't going to get into substantive issues. In the first press conference, she got into substantive issues. And Roosevelt, as we all know, did a whole group of programs in the National Youth Administration and other ways to help employ those people who were jobless. And so Eleanor did a female component to the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was looking for jobs for men, and it got the common name, the she camps, okay? She ran into resistance, and this is, again, the scramble of history. From the most interesting place, FDR appoints the first woman cabinet member, Frances Perkins, who is totally out of the role of a normal woman and had done incredible things. Well, Frances Perkins isn't that supportive of Eleanor Roosevelt, and actually they were never very close, because Frances Perkins is worried that in supporting jobs for women in the Great Depression, they might take jobs away from men, the breadwinners who needed jobs. So I think it's interesting that it shows you that, just like everything else in life, there's no one way of looking at an issue. And throughout her life, Eleanor supported women's rights, and she did after she was First Lady. And in her UN work, there was criticism of the Kennedy administration not putting women in positions. So President Kennedy goes to Eleanor Roosevelt, who did not want to support JFK till the very end, and he really went after Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt just was not a big John F. Kennedy fan, but he finally got her support, and then he put her on the President's Commission on Women. And so she did that, and then of course at the UN she ensured in every document she was involved in that women's rights were part of the issue. So I think that is a quick and dirty on Eleanor, but she did so much. It's just hard to cover all that she did. And of course, she was an example to all women going out. She was the first Lady to go to an active war site when she went to the Pacific during World War II. She would just was the president's eyes and ears and go down into the coal mine, and she would be mocked for this. You know, she'd go to a West Virginia coal mine, she'd put a coal miner's hat on, and she'd tromp down there. So there wasn't anything Eleanor wouldn't really do, and it really broke the, she drove her own car with a gun in the glove box. Yeah. She did not want Secret Service protection. Now there's two things Henry Hoover have and Eleanor Roosevelt have in common. Henry Hoover, during the Boxer Rebellion in China, carried a gun because the Boxers were threatening Westerners, and Eleanor Roosevelt promised the head of the Secret Service she would learn how to fire a gun so she could drive her car around the country and be safe.
Yep, Lou Hoover drove her own car around Washington, D.C. too. Yeah. Eleanor Roosevelt wrote a book that was entitled "It's Up to the Women." It kind of gives you an idea. Also, Eleanor Roosevelt was friends with Mary McLeod Bethune, a really prominent, important black educator, a member of Roosevelt's informal black cabinet, and was able to achieve a lot for African-American women through that friendship. It was the networks, right? Both Henry Hoover and Eleanor Roosevelt had these enormous networks, and they always came into play. And both women were acutely aware that by calling on other women, they could not only spread around the workload, but they empowered these other women to do jobs that then made them think, oh yeah, I did that. Maybe I could do this next thing too. So it's all part and parcel during the Great Depression, such a terrible, terrible time. But I think it's interesting that both the Republican president, Democratic president, two different women utilized such powerful women's networks.
Yeah.
Well, and Stacy brings up a good point. I think that the women first ladies we're looking at, they network in a different way than men as presidents do. It's a much more social way, but those networks should not be dismissed. They were extremely important, and they facilitated a lot of what we call in our textbook soft power. Right. You know, power done, but done in a softer way.
Yeah. We often say that first ladies are mirrors of their times, and that they also move the times forward. But I think we've noticed some of our first ladies were behind about 10 or 15 or 20. And before we go to Lady Bird and then to your questions, Stacy, you've been saying this for a long time, that they've lagged behind, and I think we've gotten some reasons for that, but could you do kind of a quick summary of why these women have lagged behind the times?
Well, I think the quick summary has to do with the comfort of Americans and the votes their husbands need, and the fact that they can become a target. So I have said this to Diana before. I've been saying for 30 years, I think the most successful first ladies tend to be about a generation behind regular everyday women. Successful first ladies. Okay, so why is this? I think if we say maybe not our immediate, take ourselves out of our immediate present. But I think it has to do in part with the fact that the First Lady has no job description. So her job is everything or nothing. I mean, what is it, you know? So she's there because she's married to the man we elected to be president. She's not elected, she can't be fired. You know, there's a whole heap of unusual things about the First Lady. So as a spouse, then, her job is to be a good spouse. And I think most Americans have a kind of a shared understanding of what it means to be a good spouse, right, in sickness and in health, that sort of thing. But her job then would be to take care of him, to support him, to smooth his path, not to speak against him, not to take stands that are so radically out there that they make Americans uncomfortable, that they cost him votes, right? A controversy kills votes, so if you're going to be far outside of your husband's party, that'll be a problem. And we've seen more modern first ladies voice an opinion and then have to walk it back, or at least never say it again. But the votes that a first lady with whom we are comfortable can help get votes for her husband. And I think you may, even if you are one of those Americans who feels like you really wish the First Lady would just like go get out there and make a stand, she could do that. She's not going to make everyone happy. The vast majority of Americans are pretty conservative, and we can see this over and over again in how late the United States of America has come to certain progressive issues or ideas like suffrage, like universal health care. There's all sorts of examples I could give you. So a generation, 30 years, 33 years, if you think back 30 years, 33 years to what women were doing then, you may not like it, you certainly aren't living that life, but it's at least comfortable and familiar. It feels non-threatening if a First Lady does that. And I think one of the reasons that Dr. Biden is able to be the First Lady who has got her own job, kept her job as First Lady, a remunerative job as First Lady, is in part thanks to Elizabeth Dole, who said, if I'm First Lady, I am not going to stop being head of the Red Cross. Thank you very much. And I think that planted an idea, right? And now, we're comfortable with Jill Biden being still a professor because women have had jobs for so very long now. This really doesn't seem all that shocking, I don't think. So, if you are so far out in advance, you're a target for, if it's a woman's issue, then you're a target for the patriarchy. You're a target for those who would rather see a more traditional role for women. So I think the most successful First Ladies tend to be about a generation behind, and that explains things like Michelle Obama, too, right? We were very comfortable with Michelle Obama as a mom because that's what women do. So,
yeah, the Republican motherism, just hasn't really ended. Yeah. So, Nancy, you could probably talk for weeks about Lady Bird, but we only have about 5 minutes before we need to start some questions. So can you just give us a few highlights of what Lady Bird did?
Okay. Wonderful First Lady. And she was so groundbreaking. First of all, she did the Whistle Stop campaign on her own. It's a misconception that Lyndon Johnson asked her to do it. She did it on her own. It was 1964. She's going down to the South to push the Civil Rights Act in 1964 in October. She plans the whole Whistle Stop campaign. Was planned at a time when politics was totally run by men, by 3 women, Liz Carpenter, her press secretary, Bess Sable, her social secretary, and Mrs. Johnson. And President Johnson had a holdover from the Kennedy administration as a special assistant named Kenny O'Donnell. And they were reporting to Kenny O'Donnell on what they were going to do on the Whistle Stop campaign. And Liz Carpenter does a hysterical oral history where she said that Kenny O'Donnell was typical of the Kennedy men. He wanted women, preferably at home, pregnant, and barefoot. And that was his attitude about them running the Whistle Stop campaign. So Liz and Lady Bird and Bess go to LBJ. And he thinks it's the most fantastic idea because he's worried because of the Civil Rights Act, he's going to lose the South. And because, as Lady Bird said, they need to hear someone who speaks their language. And when Lyndon Johnson pulled Kenny O'Donnell in Hart, he became very supportive of the Whistle Stop campaign. It was very dangerous. It was very successful. Mrs. Johnson got a lot of flack going through these southern towns. She went through 8 southern states from Alexandria, Virginia to New Orleans, Louisiana, and she was heckled, but she never lost her calm, and she got huge press coverage, and it was very successful for Lyndon Johnson. So that's one way she enlarged both the role of a First Lady in a political campaign and on a substantive issue. She did women doer luncheons. Instead of press conferences, she did 16 of them, and they were to highlight important issues that women did. And also, press was always invited, Mrs. Johnson being a journalist, to spread the word of what was going on in the women doer luncheons. She professionalized her press office by hiring the first professional press person, Liz Carpenter, and in doing that, she took coverage of a first lady from the society page to the front page and really made it the first lady substantive. And finally, and I'm trying to stay in the 5 minutes, beautification. Her beautification effort was so substantive. And Mrs. Johnson, by the way, hated the word beautification. She called it environmentalism, but she was told to use beautification because in the 1960s, environmentalism sounded too male or too substantive. So she stuck with beautification, but she went on and did so many substantive things in terms of highway beautification, in terms of beautifying Washington, D.C., not only in the areas that the masses see, but in less fortunate parts of Washington, D.C., and the schools. And so her thinking on that was so incredible. So those are just a few of the examples that she pushed the role of women forward, and very important, she was totally enabled by Lyndon Johnson. When I interviewed her later in the mid-'80s, she said, Nancy, Lyndon never told me what to do. He just wanted me to do what was really my heart's passion, and then he would support me. And certainly she was savvy enough to pick programs like championing Head Start and early childhood development that were in conjunction with his great society programs. But she was totally empowered, and I think that partnership really helped her accomplish what she wanted to do.
No doubt.
So that was a quick and dirty.
Yeah, very good. So your questions. Raise your hand. They will bring a microphone. If you could stand. Short question, and there's our first one.
Yeah. How many times when these ladies are getting criticized or praised, it's in fact because the slings and arrows are intended for their husbands, or the praise is intended for their husbands? It's not really criticizing or opinion about them? Am I making sense?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think it's a mixed bag. You know, Mary Lincoln got criticized for Mary Lincoln. Hillary Clinton, if we go forward, was criticized because she played too public a role on a substantive issue, and she didn't play it in a public way.
Yeah.
But she was empowered by Clinton. I think in Henry Hoover's case, or your next programs will go forward to Pat Nixon, I think you'll see first ladies who, because their husbands were not popular because of the time or what they did, are therefore not really studied the way they should be or given the credit. I think Laura Bush has done incredible things, and it's relatively early in the historical evaluation, but I certainly don't think she's gotten the full credit she should have for the things she's done. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, the paterfamilias is supposed to be in charge of the family. So if a woman puts a toe out of line, it suggests that he's unable to control her and thus to control the family. If a president has a wife he can't control, or indeed a child he can't control, the suspicion is that he can't control the country. And so I'm not sure this answers your question directly, but it does suggest another reason why first ladies didn't get far out in front of controversial things like suffrage and women's rights.
But you know, the big exception is Eleanor Roosevelt was always loving FDR. She was coming to him and pushing him, and I think he actually liked to use her If she went out and made a firestorm, he would say, I can't control my missus.
Right, and she used
Yeah.
her My Day column as a test, right? She wrote this column, syndicated column, and would float ideas of his, and if they got bad press, then he wouldn't do them. So did you want to amend your question that we apparently didn't answer?
Pat Nixon, well, and Mrs. Trump for that matter. You hardly heard a peep out of them, and yet they seem to catch flack all the time.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in 2 weeks. And I do think you're going to come away with a very different opinion of Pat Nixon after you hear the program in 2 weeks. And I think she's a good example of people not liking him and a couple things happening. Well, one thing was, and you're going to hear this, is that the men in his administration were all Kenny O'Donnells, and they didn't want her out there. Didn't want her getting all the positive press, so they suppressed a lot of it. And then, because he went out on such a bad note, a lot has been buried about that, and it was her personality too. But like I said, we're going to talk a little bit more about that one. Do we have another question?
And if I could just add on what Diana said, in terms of Pat Nixon, go back to Martha Washington. She comes in. Many people don't know she didn't have the liberty to define her role. Here she'd been doing all the stuff, running the Mount Vernon and everything.
Well,
she
and
comes
going
in.
to the camps every winter, and she's raising money to actually put clothing on the backs of the soldiers before they all deserted. Yeah.
She finds out his staff has defined her role.
Yeah.
And she was not happy about that at all. And that's when she made that comment about being
in prison. Yeah, she said she felt like a prisoner. Yeah. We have a question up in the front row. No. Oh, okay.
Any special reason we skipped Bess, Jackie, and Mamie?
Oh, good question. They actually, we define them, Nancy and Anita McBride, who you met the first night. We have two books coming out, a textbook on First Ladies and then a public version, a trade version. And we talk about the three of them as stepping back from activism. And there were some things, Bess knew she wasn't Eleanor. And Bess didn't like any of this. She had a lot of reasons why she didn't, because her father had committed suicide and the press, they weren't able to deal with that privately because he was a very public person. And so she feared the press. She didn't want to be doing anything to get their attention. She didn't want them intruding into her life. Mamie did a lot more, and especially with what were then the National Negro Women's Council. She was an honorary member, so if you want to talk about somebody who really did a lot to promote African American women's rights, it was Mamie.
And Mamie worked with the Republican women a lot. She hosted
Yeah.
them. She sort of, she was the conduit to the women in the Republican Party, very important in the 1950s.
Yeah, and I was actually going to ask about the three of them, but then I looked at the time and we jumped over, but thank you. And then Jackie, she didn't like the role that much either. She would always say, when she'd get invited to give a speech, she'd say, give it to Lady Bird. Lady Bird gave like 100 and some speeches during the Kennedy administration. Jackie gave practically none, and they were like 2 minutes long, welcoming people. And so her one thing was the White House restoration, and that was her thing. And so, nothing really on women.
hated politics. She hated the back room. She hated the cigar smoke. She hated all of that. And so when she became First Lady, the way she dealt with it, as most successful First Ladies deal with it, is she followed her passion.
Yeah.
And she had been to the White House as a girl, and she really wanted to make the White House something comparable to what she would visit in a European country. And she wanted to restore it. She thought it was appalling the way it was, and she actually passed on that issue 3 days after John F. Kennedy was tragically assassinated. She actually asked Mrs. Johnson to keep that issue and make her effort permanent. And she gave Mrs. Johnson a 7-page handwritten memo which is quite amazing to think that here was this widow going through such an incredibly traumatic thing, but she loved this project so much that she took the time to write a memo and broke the rule. First ladies never, ever really asked the next first lady to carry on their work, but she did, and Mrs. Johnson did.
Yeah, Stacy?
As a university professor, a classroom teacher, I just need to say A+ for active listening, that you picked out those 3 that we skipped.
Yeah. Very good. Good point. Good point. We had one on the front row in green sweater. Oh, and then we'll do the back because she had hers up earlier. Yeah.
Hi, yes. So there seems to be a sea change going from, you originally were talking about the first 3, and then moving, to the Gilded Age, and then moving further and further. I'm curious if you see another sea change coming with the historical things that are happening, such as Dr. Biden keeping her position, and we also now have Vice President Harris. How do you see that shaping currently, and then maybe shifting the role of First Ladies?
Who wants to start that one?
You know what? I'm a historian. I have perfect vision for the past, not so good for the future, but she has worked with First Ladies. Nancy.
Well, I would say one thing in terms of Dr. Biden keeping her job, that is true. She's the first lady to do that. But in a way, Lady Bird did, because she didn't give up management of the radio and
that's
TV
true.
empire
That's a
that
good
she
point.
had. Okay,
Yeah.
so I do want to say that they're not exactly corollary. I think that it has freed first ladies up. I think it is terribly hard, and I think Dr. Biden will say that, to go from, planning for a luncheon to grading papers to going back and forth, but it is a priority. I think part of the beauty of the job is that there's no rule book, and that the first ladies that move forward and do a good job really follow the desires of their heart. And that's what Michelle Obama said. I loved it when Laura Bush was asked, okay, what first lady are you going to follow? Are you going to be like Barbara Bush or Lady Bird Johnson? And she said, I think I'm going to be like Laura Bush. And then and Michelle Obama was asked the same thing. Yeah. So to Stacy's point, it's hard to predict, because the next first lady may want to be more home, may want to focus on other things, may have younger children. There are a whole lot of things, and Diana has given a wonderful speech, and we do in our book, on Barbara Bush being invited to Wellesley at a time when the feminist movement was raging, and the Wellesley group got all upset. They didn't want her. They wanted and she went, and she said, I know you wanted someone with color purple.
Yeah.
Alice Walker.
Yeah. And we've got time for one more question, and then I'm going to turn it back to Audrey in a minute. Yes, one more. In the back. Is there one back there?
Yes. We have an online question.
Oh, okay.
So there seems to be a correlation between active first ladies in wartime America. What are these first ladies' roles in interacting with the public during these times?
It depends upon the war, and it depends upon the century, and it depends upon the woman.
Although I think that they are very active, as was Eleanor Roosevelt was very active.
Yeah.
And
Well, Mary Lincoln.
Martha Washington,
yeah.
Mary Todd Lincoln, Laura Bush. I mean, many of them have been involved, but others not so much. I mean, the Korean conflict didn't really pull in first ladies. Vietnam War a little bit less so. So I really think it depends. I'd like to circle back and just put the emphasis on what Nancy was starting down the path, and that is that Melania Trump surprised all of us as First Lady. So history doesn't move in a straight line. The office of the non-office of First Lady doesn't move in a straight line. And of course, the next First Lady might be the first gentleman.
Yeah, true. Good point. Yes, very good point. And that was how Barbara Bush ended her Wellesley speech, by saying, you know, one of these days, someone in this audience may be replacing me, and I wish him luck. Yeah, so good point. As we said, in 2 weeks, we will be back for the 4th in the series, and Audrey's going to moderate that one. Our 2 experts are going to take us past Lady Bird and up to the present, with some concentration on Betty Ford and Pat Nixon and some of the more recent First Ladies, so please come back for that. And once again, thank you. This has just been a great turnout on a kind of yucky night. And I want to thank Sarah Stacy again, all the students from the Student Advisory Board,
Yay,
Mark
students.
back there, and all of his tech people for all of the help, and all of you for being such a great audience. We'll be around if you want to ask some more questions and talk to us personally. But Audrey, I know you have something you want to do now.
Thank you so much, Diana. Before I begin, let's go ahead and give our panel and our speakers a round of applause.
Good job, both of you.
So thank you again, Diana, Stacy, and Nancy, for that wonderful and fascinating discussion. And just one moment before we adjourn for the evening, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge someone whose participation that we really missed tonight in our audience. Last week, we learned that one of our most engaged and memorable, in the very best sense of the word, one of the members of our Student Advisory Board members passed away unexpectedly just weeks before graduation. This promising, warm young person, Noah Hoekstra, attended almost every Dole Institute event. And if you've been here, I'm sure you saw Noah and heard his fantastic questions. Without fail, almost every session that he attended, he contributed one of the most thoughtful and incisive questions, and sometimes at the Pizza and Politics sessions at the Kansas Union, he might sneak in 2 or more questions. Our conversation was wonderful tonight, but it just wasn't the same, and as a moderator and an audience member, I always looked out into the audience and have a wonderful contribution to our discussion. So before we close this evening, I would just ask if you would join me in honoring Noah's memory with a moment of silence and gratitude for the light that he shone when he was here at the Dole Institute and the time that we were able to share with him. Thank you all for your thoughtfulness and support during this hard time. Our discussions lift all of us up, and we're honored by your presence, and we're so glad you're here tonight. Please go have a wonderful evening. Thank you.